Okay, welcome to Chapter 9. This is for the Wake Tech Court Procedure and Evidence class being taught this semester being the spring semester of 2023. We're using the 10th edition of Joel Chimera's text published by Cengage Learning. And as I said, we're in Chapter 9, which is primarily about identification procedures. And we're going to look at things like lineups and show-ups and a few things like that, and eyewitnesses in general. It's somewhat curious. I've had questions from students as to why we're doing an identification procedure. Wouldn't that fit better in police operations or something like that? Well, it's hard to overestimate how important it is that we correctly identify a suspect. Currently, right now, there was a series of murders out in Idaho. 4 college students were killed. And one of the roommates who survived, I just heard on the news, and of course it's not court testimony, but I'm trying to fix the idea of the importance of identification in your mind, stated that she got up in the morning and saw a man dressed in black in a mask come downstairs and go out the door. And she gave a body description of him. Now, this begs, I think, certain questions if you think about this and keep this example in your mind as we go through this chapter. And that's, first of all, how can you tell, looking at someone who's clothed, that you're talking about someone of the male gender? How do you know that's not someone who is identifies as female or is transgender? We tend to, when we identify things, simply see and fill in the blanks. So we have to be really careful in this identification because this man, and he's indeed might be guilty. I'm not arguing he's not the person that was in that house. They do have a DNA sample of him in the house, so I think that's pretty good evidence at this point. But you have to be really careful to get the right person. So when I say careful, what's the danger? Well, let's look at this next slide. What causes misidentification? So these are wrongful convictions, and eyewitness misidentification is responsible. It is present in 75% of the cases where an individual is later exonerated because of DNA samples. Turns out he didn't do it, but there are eyewitnesses that are incorrect. So this is very important. And anything that's important begins to trigger our spidey sense, if you want, about the Constitution. We're really concerned about, well, since this is a critical area of trials and a critical area of law enforcement, what does the Constitution have to say about this? How's this going to interplay with it? Well, proving that a crime was committed is a lot easier than proving who did it. So, going back to our examples of that multiple homicide up in Idaho on the college campus. You get to the scene of the crime as a police officer. First of all, it gets reported, and hopefully we believe at least that most homicides are reported, but certainly some aren't. They go undetected. And you've got 4 bodies that were stabbed. That's very good evidence to prove that the crime of homicide is committed. But as you can see, since it took more than a month to arrest him, it can take a long time to determine who did it. And most of the time, eyewitness identification remains the way in which we prove the guilt of strangers when they commit crime. Now, I think very often in the criminal justice system, in fact in society at large, there is a deep distrust of stranger or the other. And there's nothing wrong with that because, clearly strangers can be dangerous. But at the same time, if you look at things like domestic abuse situations, almost all the time you know who hits you, you know who beats you. If you're talking about child abuse, most of the time it is the parents of the child, the step-parents of the child. It's not the stranger. Nonetheless, I think this is probably just the way humans are wired. We have a great deal of animosity innately towards a stranger. We tend to blame them for the problem, not people we know, which means the identification of people we don't know becomes very important. So this next slide These are three critical cases, three critical ideas. When we begin to look at, it's called the Wade, Gilbert, and Stovall trio, where we begin to look at this Constitution. Like I said, it's the overarching thing that we're concerned about, and identification. So until 1967, the Supreme Court of the United States really had adopted a hands-off approach to when it looked at identification. And most of these identifications we're talking about here are what we call lineups or show-ups. Basically, the Supreme Court pretty much left law enforcement on its own. And I don't think that's a surprise. I think that's pretty much how much of the Supreme Court treated it. It really wasn't as interested in criminal procedure before the 1960s as it was after. As I think what happened is more and more people began to expose to the system. Now, in U.S. versus Wade and Gilbert versus California, the first two of these cases, and both of those are 1967 cases. In fact, all of these, the Steno case as well as Stovall case we're talking about lineups or show-ups. Okay, so in the Wade case, that's the United States versus Wade, the Supreme Court banned a lineup after arrest. I think that's critical, unless the defendant's lawyer is present. And then they clarified under Gilbert, held that it is a bright line. So we get per se, which means automatic exclusion of an out-of-court lineup identification made in violation of your right to counsel. So if the police are going to have a lineup after you are arrested, your lawyer has the right to be present. And the obvious question is, well, why would you want that? And I think the obvious answer to that is to make sure that the lineup is to some degree fair. So, if you have a suspect, pick an unusual looking suspect, 6'8", Hawaiian, female. Okay, so that's pretty rare. Okay, ethnic Hawaiian, 6'8", and you put her in a lineup, and next to her are 4 African American males who are under the height of 5 feet. She is going to stick out. And it's going to say, okay, you claimed you were assaulted by a tall female. Is that tall female in this lineup? And what's going to happen is, well, that's the only one there. Witnesses like to cooperate. They like to be the police. So it's going to be a misidentification. Now, obviously, that's an extreme and silly example, but I'm trying to point out what we're talking about here. Now, in Stovall versus Deno, which was the third case, it introduced the due process rights into determining the admissibility of evidence derived from pretrial show-ups before indictment. Now, this is an interesting case. In this case, a doctor named Paul, I think his name was Brathwaite, was stabbed to death in his kitchen. His wife had followed her husband into the kitchen and jumped on the assailant, who knocked her down and stabbed her 11 times. Now, believe it or not, the police found a shirt on the floor with keys in the pocket, which they traced to Mr. Stovall. 7 police officers then brought Mr. Stovall, 7 or 8, I forget, to the hospital room on the same day that she underwent surgery to save her life. He was handcuffed, and he was the only black in the room. And she identified him at trial, and that out-of-court statement was used. And they actually accepted this lineup because of the I think because of the circumstances. You didn't know if she was going to survive. She's undergoing heart surgery. But what the court did is they said, look, in the future, we do not want anything. So when the language they used is unnecessarily suggestive. So the real thing we're concerned about is we're really concerned about the reliability. For identification evidence to be dismissed on due process grounds, you have to prove 2 things. So remember, it's presumptively probably going to get in, but you can try to keep it out, or the defense can try to keep it out by saying it was unnecessarily. And see, that's the difference with the Stovall case. If we go back to, for a second, in the Stovall case here, it's not unnecessary. She's in the hospital room. She's about to undergo surgery. She may not survive. The only way you're going to get that identification is to do it then. But let's suppose she was fine. And let's suppose she was just in the hospital waiting for her husband who was in critical condition. Now, he's actually dead, but don't worry about that. And they brought in a single suspect handcuffed to another, to a police officer. He's the only one that's of a different racial group, and they say, is this him? That's unnecessarily suggestive. So was the procedure unnecessarily and impermissibly suggestive? And we look at the totality of the circumstances to decide, did this create a substantial likelihood of misidentification? And the totality of circumstances is going to use really 5 factors to help us determine if it was unpermissible. And they can really be in any sort of order here. These are not, strictly speaking, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's why I put it in a circle as opposed to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 list. So how long between the time the crime occurred and the time you're being, and the identification? Is it a week, a day, 10 days, a year, 2 years, 10 years? How long did you have to view the defendant at the scene of the crime? So going back to that murder in Idaho, the first part of that, obviously she saw the individual very briefly, passing out of the house, I believe, at 4 in the morning. And what was your degree of attention? Now, that's the third factor. If you think about that, well, if you get up in the morning to 4 in the morning to get a glass of water, go to the bathroom or something, and you see a stranger walking your house dressed in a mask, boy, it's got your attention. The fourth thing is, what's your accuracy prior to the identification? So if you say my suspect is a 6'8" female Inuit, which is the correct term to use for Eskimo, a 6'8" female Inuit Native American, and the one you identify at the scene of the crime is a 4'2" Italian man, then your previous identification doesn't match. What's your level of certainty is the final thing. And of course, this is, a lot of these are, that pie, each one of those slices can get bigger and smaller. And then the courts are really going to have to look at this and decide, are we going to let everything in? All right, let's look at a drug case. I believe this next one is about heroin, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. It's Manson versus Brathwaite. It came down in 1977. Okay, so this individual, Brathwaite, was charged with possession and selling heroin. Now, he was found guilty, and he got, I think, 6 or 10 years, something like that. So we have an undercover police officer. I believe the officer's name was Glover or Cover or something like that. And basically, he went to buy narcotics from someone, and it's colorful names here, someone that was called Dickie Boy Cicero, a known narcotics dealer. Okay, so they thought he lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. Glover, and I think he had a partner with him, if I'm not mistaken, goes there. And they're being backed up, and knock on the door of one of the apartments, and it wasn't Cicero's apartment. So there's a little bit of light coming in. It's about 7, quarter of 8 in the morning. The door opens, not completely, just a little bit, and Glover sees a guy standing there, and I think there was someone else in the apartment behind him, a woman or his wife or something. And the undercover officer says he wants some narcotics. And the man at the door holds out his hands, and this undercover officer gives him some cash. And then the guy leaves for a second, comes back, and gives him some heroin. So the question is, as at this point, let's go back to that previous slide. How long did you have to look at him? Were you paying attention? How accurate is your description going to be? Now, he's within 2 feet of this person, and you've got about 5 minutes from the time that the door opened until it closed the second time. So they didn't know who this was, but they described him in a certain way. They identified him, and we're going to use some I'm actually going to look at the case here for a second. I'm going to read you how they described him. A colored man, approximately 5 feet 7 inches, dark complexion, black hair, short afro style, having high cheekbones and heavily built. He was wearing at that time blue pants and a plaid shirt. They realized that this might be someone else, and one of the police officers suspected that this was Brathwaite. So they didn't know him personally, or some of them didn't, but they did know him by sight because they'd seen him a couple times. So they arrest Brathwaite, and then they bring him in for a show up. They bring him in. So Brathwaite is identified as the seller after brief observation and a single photo show up. In other words, here, is this the guy? It's not, here's these 5 guys it could be. So one of the questions becomes in the Brathwaite case is, okay, a regular witness, going back to our murder in Idaho, that woman who's in the house at 4 in the morning, is she subject to that totality of circumstances test? And the answer is yes. Well, does it also apply to the police? Are they somehow special? And in the majority opinion here, the court said, well, yes, they are. The majority opinion says they are as responsible as a regular eyewitness or anybody else. So they're going to have to meet that same totality of circumstances. Now, there was a dissent in this case. The dissent showed it was very likely that there was a substantial likelihood of misidentification here. That dissent was written by Marshall and Brennan, but the courts overruled it and said it was good enough. Now, that's a show-up where you're really only seeing one person. That case, that Stovall case with the doctor, that's a show-up too. This one's a show-up with a photograph. So what about accidental show-ups? This is defined when the witness sees the suspect not in a lineup or a show-up, but by accident. So typically the suspect's in police custody or is in a courtroom, and the eyewitness sees them. Is this a violation? And the courts have said, no, it's not. It's generally not viewed as one. Let's look at Perry versus New Hampshire. This case is a fairly recent case. It came down in 2012. So Perry is charged with breaking into a car and stealing a stereo. And he claimed, nope, I just found him on the ground. And he's in custody. And while he's in custody, an identification is made that, yeah, that's the guy that did it. And this was accidental. They didn't bring the witness over. They didn't. It's 2 in the morning. Okay. And the opinion of the court said this was an accidental show-up. We're not going to impose a stronger duty of process. Enough procedural safeguards are here. Now, there's some contention here, but and this is a opinion by Ginsburg, if I'm not mistaken. And it surprisingly be Ginsburg. But the dissent said whether it's improper or not, or bad luck, it's still unreliable to do these show-ups. So, the minority opinion here is really trying to push the idea, and it's Sotomayor is trying to push it, that show-ups or single identifications are just going to lead to too many problems. And that you really should isolate the witnesses and only let them see the suspect, I guess, essentially, after there's multiple options to identify. Okay, so here's some. This is a really fascinating part because these are 10 statements about memory that you will hear constantly that we're pretty sure scientifically are false. Not just pretty sure, they're false to a degree of scientific certainty. So let's look at them. One, and this one I think many people realize is false. Memory is like a recording that can be played back. That's not how memory works. In fact, when you remember something, you're actually not remembering it. You're, believe it or not, remembering the last time you remembered it. Two, if you're confident in a memory, you're more likely right. Confidence in memory has almost no impact on veracity. Three, memory is stable over time. Absolutely false. Memories change, memories evolve, people add things to it. Four, memory is isolated from later information you learn. That's not true either. If you have a memory that someone was wearing a blue shirt, and then you hear over and over again that it was a red shirt, and you think about it, people will say, yeah, I guess it was red. You changed it when new information comes in. Here's a big one. Facial recognition is a common skill and accurate. That is, people can look at people's faces, remember them, and they can't. Actually, what we know a lot about this now is that people tend to focus on one or two distinctive features on a face and kind of keep the rest in their background. So if someone has a large nose or has protruding ears or has, really blue eyes, you're going to remember that. And if you see three suspects and only one of them has the blue eyes, that's the one you're going to pick out. Repeating memory reinforces it, making it stable. Not true. Eyewitnesses are generally accurate. Not true. Weapons make memory stronger. In other words, if you're in fear, you're going to remember more often. Not true. In fact, some of our evidence tends to show that being in fear in a heightened emotional state actually makes your memories less reliable. Here's a big one. Trauma makes memory stronger. Absolutely false. There's been horrific cases of absolute violation of human beings, like rape, and it doesn't make the identification stronger just because someone went through that experience. Violent events create stronger memories. Not true. And these are 10 things that I think we all kind of believe, or parts of them we believe, which we've studied empirically, done test after test, and by and large, they're simply not true. Okay, so let's look at some of the social science and mistaken eyewitnesses. There's really 3 phases of how a memory works. We get the memory, we perceive it. The second part is we retain it. And the third part is we retrieve it. So, I teach for a living, and one of the things I tell people is that we acquire information really based upon all our senses. So if you're just getting one sense, right, then your acquisition is limited. So if you're just reading a textbook, you might be really good at remembering written words. But trust me, by adding a little bit more, by adding, okay, I watched the lecture and I also heard the lecture, that can help you remember stuff. And then it can be even stranger than that. You're trying to remember, what was in a chocolate cake or what was in a holiday cake. And you remember seeing the cake, and you remember someone baking the cake and telling you about it. But then what's something else that's going to trigger it? Oh yeah, the smell. It had cinnamon in it because I remember the smell of cinnamon. So the next part is retention, storing information. And lots of things can interfere with this. So, one of the things that can interfere with it is the use of drugs or the use of alcohol. And you have to, physically create a memory in your mind. And things can interfere with that. And then you have to bring it back up. You have to remember it. And as I said, what we think now is that you don't remember an event, You remember remembering the event, believe it or not. Okay, so when we look at these mistakes, when eyewitnesses make mistakes, the most common identification procedures don't take place in ideal settings. So let's go back to that girl who saw the stranger in the house at 4 in the morning. That's not an ideal setting. And as we said, this is absolutely critical because 75% of wrongful convictions that we later are overturning because of DNA are because someone misidentified who it was. So let's look at these different things. Remember I said it's acquisition, retention, and retrieval. Acquisition refers to when you take it in and you don't record every detail. You just don't get it. Your perceptions can be more important than your reality. That's how magicians can trick you. That's how a magician can take something, and by moving his hand in a particular way, distract you and get you to believe that there's magic. We all know there's no such thing as magic. But have you been distracted? Has there been a loss of focus? How long did you have to look at something? How much stress were you under? All of these affect the degree of your acquisition of information. Retention refers to you got the information, you stored it, right? And now you're going to identify the person. And one of the things we know is that memory starts to fade very rapidly. Your mind simply can't keep every event that happened in your life locked in your brain 24/7. From the second you wake up to the second you go to sleep, and your dreams. Think about, I like to talk about this when I say think about your dreams. You wake up from a dream and you remember it a little bit. And then as the day goes on, it kind of fades out and you say, oh yeah, I think I was in a haunted house, or I think I was, surfing at Big Sur or something. Something was going on. And then within a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and I say, yeah, what was that dream you had, you were telling me about? Oh, God, I forgot. You might remember one or two things. As a witness's memories fade, though, the confidence in their memories can actually rise. And judges and juries, because we're human beings, tend to say, okay, we're going to believe this person's memories. So retrieving this memory. Recalling and recognition. Now, recall is you're given hints and asked to report what you've seen. So, for example, I was teaching at the Raleigh Police Academy several years ago, and they had a bunch of cadets in there. And one of the things that happened is they had a police officer dress up, walk into the classroom while they were taking a regular class, set off a gun, blanks, shoot up in the air, walk out of the room. And then they said, okay, you all saw someone walk in here. You all saw had a baseball cap on. Now, tell me, was it a New York Yankees, a Boston baseball cap? Was it tell me the team's name. And they all wrote down different names. And the thing was, there was no baseball cap. They were given a hint. Hey, he had a baseball cap on. And if you think about, let's suppose you're trying to identify a suspect of the crime, the police come to you and say, he was wearing a baseball cap, what was he wearing? Well, the most commonly worn baseball cap in the United States in regards to team signias is the New York Yankees. So if you said, well, I have a memory of a New York Yankee baseball cap, you would say New York Yankees. It may not be, but your mind is filling in the blank. So there's recall and recognition, where you're shown people or objects and asked if this is the one. So one is I can say, who was it? And the other one I can say is this the one? So retrieval can lead to two broad errors. You can omit details. Oh yeah, I forgot. Let's go to that woman who saw the man in the house in Idaho. Let's suppose our suspect, the ones arrested, I saw him on the news last night, had black hair. But let's suppose when she saw him, he was bald, and she just doesn't recall that detail. So there's errors of omission, you fail to recall a key things, and then there's errors of commission, where you pick out someone that's not correct. And we do have to guard against the power of suggestion. Most misidentifications result from natural memory imperfections and suggestions, and this is very powerful when you're trying to retrieve it. So if a police officer says, again, going back to that example of that baseball cap, what was the baseball cap? What's going to happen is your mind is going to say, well, there was a baseball cap. He just mentioned it. Yeah, I remember it. This is suggestion. And you're going to fill in the blank. And there's been some really fascinating studies where they tell little kids that they went to Disney World. They never went. But they tell the kids that, and then 6 months they come back and they go, have you ever been to Disney World? And the kid remembers being told it was, and he creates, via the power of suggestion, a memory. Yeah, I went to Disney World. One of the most frightening cases I've ever seen of this power of suggestion occurred here in North Carolina in Tarboro. There was a child care facility for young children, and there was an accusation. It started off very small and then it snowballed that there were Satan worshipers running this daycare center, that they were sexually abusing the children, and they had some very bad interview processes with children. And they made all sorts of suggestive things, and they would reward the children when the children told them about a crime. They'd say, okay, I'll give you an ice cream cone, Johnny, if you tell me where he touched you. Or, all right, Susie, I will give you an ice cream cone. Or you can, go out and play if you'll just tell me how many times they hit Billy. Well, that's suggesting that, and children are very prone to suggestions. And remember, there's people as eyewitnesses that are just as prone. So there is a very substantial likelihood of misidentification. How long did you have? Were you paying attention? How accurate? How certain? How long between? So what are the three primary ways in which an identification process goes forward? Because I've thrown out these words like lineups, show-ups. Here are the three that are most common. A lineup, which you should know what that is, right? You have 5 people, and you have the eyewitness. You say, okay, these 5, who is it? You have a show-up where you usually have a single suspect. And then when you don't have real people, but you have mugshot identification, like, okay, here is 5 potential people it could be. Tell me if it's one of them. All right. Psychological research and some eyewitness identification. One of the things is that as a defense counsel, and I've never been a prosecutor, I've always been a defense counsel, we almost always lose arguments when we say that the eyewitness account is no good. People just tend to believe eyewitnesses. And the test remains the law of the land, despite empirical research that says eyewitness evidence and 75% of these DNA cases result in problems. So we've done a fair amount of research about a lot of this. There have been archival research where we've examined real procedures used in criminal cases. And then there's been experimental research where researchers create crimes that people witness, like those police cadets at Raleigh. Now, there's been some criticism in that, well, you're using students, it's not the same level of fear, the participants know that they might make errors or mistakes, is not as important. But experimentally, unless you were filming all the time to try to catch a crime, it's very hard to get to any other way except, here, let's see if this works. Eyewitness retrospective self-reports. These are relied upon very heavily by courts. Now, psychologists consider them to be very unreliable because they are highly malleable. There's lots of ways you can change people's interpretations. That your memory is not a constant. Do you want to remember? Do you want to appear to be consistent? If you said, oh yeah, it was a guy, and then you say, wait a minute, I'm remembering another detail, but if I say it wasn't a guy, it might have been a girl, I'm going to look bad. And you might not even go through that process consciously. So, an empirical assessment. Psychologists recommend that a lineup always includes more than one suspect, but not more than one. In other words, if you have 5 people that might have committed a crime, you don't put 3 of them in the lineup with 2 ringers. You put 4 people in the lineup who didn't do it and 1 of your suspects. Suspects and fillers should resemble one another and wear similar clothing. Don't put 4 people in a lineup who are in, plaid dresses and 1 person who is in a leotard. And because that person is going to stick out and people are going to say, I think it's her. Pre-lineup instructions. Witnesses tend to think the suspect must be in the lineup. So one of the things you should tell people is they may or may not be there. One of the interesting controls is to simply show them a lineup with 5 people who can't have committed the crime and see if they say, yeah, it's number 7. Because there you're starting from an empirical base to see how good they are. Now show-ups are worse. Show-ups are substantially less reliable, but they're used more frequently. And if we go back to that Stovall case, that's a show-up. And the reason you're going to use it there is, okay, you've got someone who witnessed a homicide and she's getting wheeled into surgery. That's the only time we're going to get an identification. So when do we have show-ups? Well, you can have accidental encounters between witnesses and suspects. You can have emergencies, like I said, or you can have a suspect that's on the loose. All of these tend to impact, reliability issues. All right. Now, speaking of, this is what's called sometimes the Manson variability, or reliable variables. It comes out of a case of Manson. All right. The next one is psychological research and this Manson reliability variables. In Manson, the court equated the amount of time you're looking at a suspect's face with how likely you're going to remember it. But psychologists have said it's not as critical as you think. Psychologists looking at Manson have said, well, it's good that the court came up with this if they want, but it's really not impacting how memory forms. It's more important what you were doing than how long you were doing it. So you might have been a clerk, at a retail establishment, McDonald's or something, serving burgers. You might have looked at someone for 3 minutes. That's not going to necessarily fix the memory any better than, what were you doing? Well, I was dangling from the edge of a cliff. Your attention's a little bit more focused. What's your opportunity to view? Distance is a major, major factor. Now, most people can view a face with some degree, not a lot, but some degree of exactitude, being able to identify up to 25 feet away. But it begins to fall off rapidly after that. And by the time you're at 100, 150 feet, you have 0 probability you can correctly identify someone by facial recognition. Now, you might be able to identify people by body movement. Sometimes people have an unusual walk or gait, and sometimes they can put it on and take it off. In addition to distance, again, how much time did you have? So what are some recommendations? If we've got these issues, how do we reform it? Well, the psychologists, and to be honest, defense lawyers, argue that you should have a per se rule, an automatic rule that excludes all evidence if it is a suggestive identification, and looser standards for admitting expert testimony on human perception. In other words, don't rely as much on common sense because our common sense is wrong here. Rely upon what experts say. Now, I'm going to give you a brief aside here because there's often, and I'm seeing it increasingly, a rejection of science. People say, well, I was a scientist now. I've got my common sense. I know what's right. Or I did my own research or something like that. Okay, so here's an example. If you ask most people, take a 10-pound ball, take a 1-pound ball, same size, same diameter, one weighs 10 times as much, drop them from 10 feet high, which one hits the ground first? Most people will say the 10-pound ball hits the ground first. They're wrong. Gravity is a constant. You fall at the same rate if you weigh 10 pounds or 1 pound. We're going to ignore friction for a moment there. So they both hit the ground at the same time. So common sense tells you something wrong. But if you bring in any physicist, he can tell you with certainty the balls will hit the ground at the same time. So experts should have a little bit more leeway here. The next thing is, and there's some human history of this, you should require corroboration of eyewitness identifications in some cases. And you should mandate that police use the best procedures. All these are recommendations for fixing some of these problems. So, here are some recommendations by legislatures and law enforcement agencies. Utilize non-suspect fillers. Utilize double-blind procedures. Instruct eyewitnesses they may or may not be present, and don't let the person running the test know which one it is. Present the suspects sequentially rather than simultaneously. So 1, 2, 3, 4, not all together. Assess their confidence after identification, and avoid multiple identification procedures in which you have the same witness being run through, because eventually we're going to say that's going to do it. All right, let's move on to some other, and there was a case in your text. It was State versus Clopton. I didn't include it primarily because it's a Utah Supreme Court case. Not that I have anything against Utah, but it's Utah as opposed to the United States Supreme Court. So let me move on to the next one, which is forensic science and identification evidence. So here are some of the things that can help us identify people. DNA evidence, kind of self-explanatory. This is something, either identify people or identify things. Controlled substances, blood types, hair analysis, bite marks, voice analysis, handwriting, death, poisons, firearms or tools, and digital evidence. All these can be pretty important. So let's look at them just very briefly. DNA, which didn't really exist until, it always existed, but it wasn't identified until Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize for it in the 1960s, and didn't become widespread a tool until the 2000s. Now, DNA is a useful tool, but what about controlled substances? Why is that up there? Well, if you see a white powder, how do you know what it is? Is it fentanyl? Is it cocaine? Is it powdered sugar? Blood type. Are you A? Are you B? Are you AB? Are you O? Those are just 4 types, but then there's positives, negatives. There's actually, it's much more complex than that. So it can really affect identification. Let me give you an example of how complex it is. There was a serial killer in the Soviet Union. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. And Andrei Chikatilo had, we think, somewhat cloudy, but we think he was a very unusual individual in that almost all males, when they have a blood type, so I'm going to simplify this, have a blood type of O, if you gather a semen sample from them, that will tell you that they have an O blood type. But there is, we believe, a very small number of people that secrete different blood types. So Chikatilo might have been an AB, right, blood type, because remember the 4 classic blood types are A, B, AB, and O. So let's suppose Chikatilo, and I'm simplifying this, was AB, but he secreted A. So there was a murderer. Chikatilo was a serial killer. He killed little girls primarily, killed and raped them. They had some semen samples. They knew that the suspect was a blood type B, right? They go to Chikatilo, they take his blood type, they don't take a semen sample, and it turns out he's an A. So they eliminated him. Unfortunately, he was the one that was doing it. So this shows you how important identification can be, because sometimes you get it wrong. Hair analysis, bite marks. If you want to, know how important bite marks is, there was a sports broadcaster, Marv Albert, I believe was his name, who got in trouble because he bit, as I recall, a prostitute, if I'm not mistaken. And they took photos of it and proved that he committed the assault. So you can use that identification. Yeah, I guess an unusual bite mark. Voice analysis, handwriting, self-explanatory. Death, why did people die, how did they die, what poisons were used, what firearms or tools were used, and what digital evidence exists. So, you can have things like gathering and processing electronic documents, emails, phone numbers, call logs, GPS tracking. So again, this murder that occurred in Idaho is focusing quite a bit on whether the suspect's phone was pinging off the tower. And it wasn't during the murders, and their argument is he turned it off. And they're trying to show the absence of it might mean that he did it. I'll be interested to follow that. So the only thing we want to touch on heavily is DNA here. And this is one of the most interesting ones is there a constitutional right after conviction to get to previously produced forensic evidence? Now, there's widespread agreement that DNA can distinguish between people. And there are some societies that argue you should have a universal DNA profile to help you solve crimes. All right, let's look at one more thing. Let's look at a case. And this case it actually comes out of Alaska, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Does the state's refusal to grant DNA testing deny due process? So we have a kidnapping, a rape, and an attempted murder. So what happens is two guys were going through, I think it was Anchorage, if I'm not mistaken, and they solicited sex from a prostitute. And she agreed, and she was going to charge $100, whatever it was. Got in their car. They found a place. They parked. She asked for money in advance. One of the guys pulled a gun, forced her to have sex, so committed rape, both oral and vaginal rape. They used, the passenger actually used a condom, which if you think about it is not as strange, because if you're going to commit a rape, you don't want to leave a DNA sample. And told her to lie down in the snow. She refused. They choked her. They beat her. She tried to run away. They beat her with an axe handle, and finally they shot her in the head and left her there. Then they kicked some snow up on her and left her. Now, she didn't die. The bullet actually, even though it hit her in the head, it only grazed her. So she finds her way back. She flags down a passenger car. She gets home. She gets medical care. She calls the police. The police recover the shell casing, the axe handle, the clothing, and the condom. Okay, so 6 days later, this is a arrest. They arrest these two. There's a trial. There's a conviction. But the question is, after conviction, if you were convicted and the DNA was never tested, and now it's 2020 and these people are in jail, and Osborne and Jackson have been convicted of kidnapping, assault, and sexual assault. They were actually acquitted of the murder charge. They got, one of them got like 25 years in prison. 5 of them were suspended. And one of the things that started was our DNA testing got better. And now we could conduct a test. So do you have a right on appeal to get the DNA testing done? And this is Chief Justice Roberts. And Chief Justice Roberts said, no. There is no constitutional due process right to DNA testing after conviction. Now, the dissent was, well, why shouldn't you? The state says there's no reason not, and the state says we're not going to do it because we want the judgment to be final. Well, that's nice, you want it to be final, the dissent said. And the dissent is written well, there's a couple dissents actually. There's a dissent by Stevens, which was the kind of majority dissent because it was joined by Ginsburg, Breyer, and Souter. But Souter also wrote a kind of a sub part of it. They said, look, you may want this to be final, but it shouldn't overrule seeing that justice is done. Which really leads us to our last slide, last thing to talk about, flawed forensic evidence. The reason for flawed tests. Well, first of all, it's a monopoly. Who's doing the tests? Only one group. Almost all tests are done by the state, not by individuals. There's a dependence bias. There can be poor quality control. There can be a lack of information sharing. There can be no division of labor between analysis and interpretation. There can be a lack of competition. Now, governors, prosecutors, courts all recognize some of these problems. Okay, this idea, particularly of information sharing, what I would call more information. I like the term your book used, which was information pollution, which I thought was a really good term here. Basically, it contributes to the idea, governors, prosecutors, courts recognizing that these statutes contribute to the idea that innocent people, based on faulty forensic evidence, get convicted. And you do have a constitutional right to confront people. And if you can't exercise that right, you're being convicted by evidence which is no good. You're being convicted by evidence that has, really been admitted and it shouldn't have, or it shouldn't have been challenged. There was no way you could look at it. It's very difficult because at the same time we want to trust science, we have to be a little bit careful about it. Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. I'm not going to go too far down that hole. That's about 50 minutes like I like. Whenever you're ready, you can go over to Chapter 10, which will be one of the next ones we're going to look at. Chapter 10, let me just flip forward here, is remedies for constitutional violations. So again, we're really going to look at things like why or what we do when we find. Oh, by the way, I should mention this. There's a Latin phrase here, ipse decit, which is Latin for meaning without proof. So some of these statutes contribute to convicting innocent people. And most states, I think it's about 45 states or 46 states, might have been 44, have statutes, these ipse dixit statutes, that authorize the state to prove its forensic allegations by relying upon certificates instead of live testimony. So essentially, forensic statutes say, we don't have to produce someone that's got a PhD, we can produce someone that's got a certificate. And it might really, we can say, okay, this is valid. How do you know it's valid? Here's the certificate of the guy that ran the test. Well, where's the guy that ran the test? Well, we don't have to produce him. That's what we're talking about here. Okay. Sorry about going down that rabbit hole. I won't do it again. All right. And if you're interested, one quick thing, go ahead and read the Melendez-Diaz case versus Massachusetts. It came down in 2009. It's the last case there in Chapter 9. All right, well, have a good evening, afternoon, or day, whatever it is, and I will see you all for Chapter 10.